Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll probably ask you to go ahead and mute your line using *6 to keep from any feedback on this presentation. So I'll encourage you to do that. All right, thanks again for attending, everyone. Today we'll be briefly discussing a new HIV treatment called Triumeq. Triumeq is known as TRII in other regions, but in Canada this treatment is seeking review under the name Triumeq. This webinar is being provided by the Canadian Treatment Action Council. My name is Adam Cook, and I'm a policy researcher here with CTAC. We are Canada's national civil society organization addressing access to treatment, care, and support for people living with HIV and hepatitis C. As part of our mandate to meaningfully engage community members, service providers, and policymakers, we are reaching out to you today to inform about this new medication and get your feedback. A brief discussion of our agenda here today. We're going to discuss the common drug review and market access. We're going to discuss some of the key attributes of Triumeq. We're going to review some of the clinical trial data from Triumeq, and then we're going to briefly conclude and direct you to our survey. Let's briefly discuss Canada's drug regulatory process and how drugs enter the market or are approved for consideration on one of Canada's many public health plans. The regulatory approval process begins with Health Canada examining clinical trial data. Health Canada reviews a drug's safety and efficacy as well as its compliance with our food, drug, and safety laws. Health Canada is primarily concerned with safety and efficacy. Is the treatment safe, and does it do what it presumes to do? If the treatment in question does comply with these regulations, then this treatment is given a notice of compliance and is permitted to proceed to our other review and regulatory bodies. The notice of compliance gives the manufacturer approval to sell the drug in Canada. And just a brief reminder, I'm hearing some feedback, so do press *6 on your line to mute it so it's not feeding back there. And then at the end when we take questions, feel free to press the #6 to unmute your microphone again. This diagram helps explain the drug development, review, and market stages in Canada, and it includes notes that detail how CTAC participates in this process. The gray cycle indicates the industrial experience. The red indicates the Health Canada experience. The blue line suggests an ever-present vigilance by regulatory bodies, the public, and health professionals. We are always working on our knowledge exchange tools to make them more accessible and useful, and this diagram is no exception. It may appear to be a little complicated, and it is true that the regulatory review system in Canada is a little hard to navigate, but we do our best to try to make these as clear as possible. Specifically, let's direct our attention to this point in gray, which notes drug submission. You'll notice the accompanying CTAC practice. Ensure the inclusion of people living with HIV and/or HCV in the patient input process. That's what we're doing here today. The Triumeq treatment is in its review process, and the submission requires input from people like yourself. Once this presentation concludes, we will ask you to participate in a short survey. The results of that survey will be sent to the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology and Health to function as the patient input portion of this drug's application for review. CTAC encourages the conclusion of new and effective treatments on public insurance plans, and as we move along the circle, we see that CTAC is continually involved in increasing education, disseminating information, and translating knowledge. We share these resources with national stakeholders, other groups, industry partners, but most importantly, we share them with people living with HIV/AIDS and/or hepatitis C. We try to keep people informed of the treatment landscape, as well as alert them to the development of new medications. So as discussed, Health Canada provides the early evaluation of a treatment and its clinical trial. There are two options. Either a treatment receives a notice of compliance and proceeds to the Common Drug Review, or proceeds to the Common Drug Review before a notice of compliance is issued, with the understanding of the notice of compliance review is underway. In the case of something like Triumeq, whose components have all received past approval, it itself is entering the Common Drug Review with a pre-notice of compliance. So while Health Canada decides whether a treatment is eligible to be sold in Canada, but there's another mechanism to decide whether a treatment should be listed on a public insurance plan. There are presently 19 public formularies managing public drug plans, 13 representing each province or territory, and 6 separate federal bodies. So while Health Canada has decided on a treatment's participation in the market, it's the Common Drug Review that makes a recommendation or suggestion as to whether a treatment should be listed for public insurance. The Common Drug Review, hereafter called the CDR, is administered by the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technology in Health, who I will refer to as CADTH. The manufacturer submits their treatment or drug to the CDR for review. The CDR then evaluates the submission, which includes clinical trial data, product monographs, and input from people who are interested in the treatment. The CDR is trying to decide if the treatment in question is safe, is it effective, are its costs defensible against other treatments, does it provide a significantly lower cost or a significantly better treatment experience. The CDR complements this data with patient input from people like you. Again, the CDR makes a suggestion, but the provinces get to make the final decision for their respective provincial plans. In order to improve the health outcomes for people living with HIV and or hepatitis, CTAC endeavors to ensure that all drugs demonstrating clinical improvement over existing treatments be approved for listing on all public drug plans. We believe they must be made available by all public formularies to improve treatment access. All provinces participate except for Quebec, which has its own process. So while Health Canada has reviewed for safety and efficacy, the CDR does the same, but also reviews the social value. The CDR has traditionally had a mechanism that allowed a priority review of the treatment if it provided significant improvements in efficacy or cost relative to existing treatments. At present, the CDR priority review process is being reviewed and reformed. We anticipate the revised priority review procedure will look similar, and CTAC has answered CADTH's call for suggestions. Today you are participating in the webinar in order to give you the information you'll require to respond to those CDR questions related to the treatment application. Because the CDR focuses on the social value of the treatment, CADTH is very interested in your thoughts. For example, is this new treatment better than existing treatment? And if so, does the increased benefit justify an increased cost to the public? And if it does, how much cost is justified? We will offer the survey at the conclusion to gather your responses. Now, when the CDR concludes, it makes a suggestion to list the drug for public insurance plans, to not list the drug, to list the drug with conditions, or to defer a listing recommendation until information in the submission is clarified. A full and unrestricted listing is uncommon. List with criteria is the more common recommendation. It establishes the treatment as an option, and it still allows the public provincial drug plans room to realize their priorities. Do not list at current price is a suggestion that would require the manufacturer to submit a new price, largely because the original price was not reconcilable with its social value, or provinces should negotiate this price with the manufacturer. And finally, do not list is a suggestion based on the drug providing no demonstrable therapeutic benefit beyond what exists on public drug plans presently. CDR will use your input and data when reviewing the drug and will very likely cite or refer to it in their written conclusion. Your participation today is extremely important, and we are very appreciative for it. So this will conclude the portion of our presentation where we briefly go over the Common Drug Review. Worth noting that we're also presently preparing a standalone presentation on the CDR itself that can stand as a living presentation to be revised as the CDR itself is revised. So the main focus of our discussion here today is a new HIV medication called Triumeq. Triumeq is also known as TRII in other regions, but the submission application in Canada is based on the treatment's name being Triumeq. Triumeq is a fixed-dose combination of dolutegravir, abacavir, and lamivudine. Dolutegravir is an unboosted integrase inhibitor, or an INI, while abacavir and lamivudine are both nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, or NRTI. Triumeq is recommended for the treatment of HIV-1. Now, while I'm sure we're all aware, it certainly bears repeating some of the mechanisms by which the HIV virus works. Specifically, the HIV virus targets CD4 cells. It takes over the cell and uses it to replicate more copies of the virus. The virus transcripts or transforms its RNA into DNA and uses the enzyme integrase to integrate that DNA into the host cell, which changes the host cell's function and forces it to replicate viral copies. Integrase is an essential part of viral replication, so blocking it can help halt viral spread. These are also known as integrase strand transfer inhibitors because they literally inhibit the transfer of a strand of genetic material from the virus to the host cell. Integrase inhibitors specifically are exciting in their efficacy for treatment-naive patients, but also exciting to those who may have developed HIV resistances to drugs that target the two other major enzymes involved in replication, reverse transcriptase and protease. So this is a once-daily pill that is a fixed-dose combination, as said, of 50 milligrams of dolutegravir, 600 milligrams of abacavir, and 300 milligrams of lamivudine. All three of these components exist as approved treatments or as approved components of other treatments in Canada and or the United States. And that's actually part of the reason that this was able to proceed pre-notice of compliance from Health Canada. Dolutegravir is also available as TRII. Abacavir and lamivudine exist as a combination called Covexa. Triumeq can be considered then something of a combination between TRII and Covexa. Now, as a result, anything that we can say about the components of dolutegravir, abacavir, lamivudine, we can also say about Triumeq. And this will come up again later as we discuss clinical data. One important thing to note, and I may be redundant on this point, Triumeq includes abacavir. Some people may have an allergy or a sensitivity to abacavir that has been associated with increased risk of cardiac events. Fortunately, there's a genetic marker allele that notes this sensitivity, and you can be screened for it. But anyone considering Triumeq or any other medication, including abacavir, is encouraged to be screened for abacavir sensitivity. Now, Triumeq's submission to the Common Drug Review is based on the following studies. A bioequivalence data study showing that Triumeq as a combination is not inferior to its components. And there are also 4 clinical trials associated with Triumeq's application: the single study, Spring 2 study, the Flamingo study, and the sailing study. We'll go over each in detail except the sailing study, which largely reinforces the other studies and specifically demonstrates the non-inferiority of dolutegravir alone. The manufacturer was able to satisfactorily address the bioequivalence of Triumeq's components. This was done in a randomized 2-part study comparing the components of Triumeq separately against the fixed-dose version of Triumeq. The 66 participants were tested when fed or fasted, and the study determined that whether as a fixed dose or in its separate components, dolutegravir, abacavir, and lamivudine can be taken with or without food, and the treatment is bioequivalent to its components. The single study sought to compare Triumeq against another combination. It was a placebo-controlled study featuring 400-plus participants focusing on naive patients. This was Triumeq compared against efavirenz, tenofovir, and emtricitabine, also known as EFV, TDF, FTC. Now, the data on this confirms that Triumeq once daily was superior to EFV, TDF, FTC in the treatment of naive HIV-1 patients. At the 48-week analysis, we had 88% virologic response against 81%. Now, just over 5% of the patients involved were co-infected, and there was with hepatitis C, and a wide variation of viral load was observed in the participants. So they were testing a broad efficacy over viral loads as well. At the conclusion of 48 weeks, the data reasoned that Triumeq was superior to the other combinations. At 96 weeks, Triumeq continues to outperform EFV, TDF, FTC. Triumeq demonstrated approximately 8% fewer dropouts due to adverse events, and most interestingly, the time to viral suppression with Triumeq was approximately 1/3 that of ESV, TDF, FTC. So Triumeq reported significantly fewer treatment-related adverse events, and fewer than 1% of all participants in the Triumeq arm dropped out of single due to adverse events, whereas over 15% of participants treated with ESV, TDF, FTC dropped out due to adverse events. So well more tolerable as far as this data is concerned. Single noted no significant differences in protocol-defined virologic failure between high and low viral load subgroups, making it a very broadly effective treatment. There were in this study noted some small and non-progressive changes in serum creatinine in the Triumeq arm, but this is a known effect of dolutegravir as it inhibits tubular creatinine secretion. Ultimately, what we can take away from single is that this study demonstrates that Triumeq is superior to ESV, TDF, FTC. 80% of the Triumeq arm achieved fewer than 50 viral copies per milliliter versus 75% of the ESV, TDF, FTC arm. There were no major INI or NRTI resistance mutations detected through the entire 96 weeks, and that, again, contributes to Triumeq being considered ultimately a more tolerable treatment. Again, fewer discontinuations, lower rates of adverse events, lower rate of liver chemistry elevations. Triumeq statistically better performed in CD4 cell count change from baseline as well. So we can consider really the results here to show that Triumeq is statistically better than its compared combinations and tends to result in fewer adverse effects or side effects, making it more tolerable overall and specifically more tolerable than ESV, TDF, FTC. Let's discuss the Spring 2 study, which involved 400 plus participants. It was an active controlled study featuring naive patients. And this was dolutegravir plus 2 NRTIs compared against raltegravir plus 2 NRTIs. NRTIs, again, are a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor. These function by integrating themselves into viral genetic information and interfering with how the virus replicates itself. Now, these are very similar to integrase inhibitors, but they target a different enzyme involved in viral replication. So a reminder then, of course, that Triumeq is functionally dolutegravir plus 2 NRTIs. Now, nearly 20% of all participants were co-infected with hepatitis C in this study, and the largest majority of the participants were men. At 48 weeks, dolutegravir demonstrated a superiority to raltegravir, with approximately 7% more receiving virologic response. At 96 weeks, dolutegravir again outperforms raltegravir in virologic response, approximately 81% to 76%. The proportion of dolutegravir subjects achieving virologic response was not significantly different by use of the different accompanying NRTIs, or high versus low HIV-1 viral copies. So again, this study tends to tell us that the association necessarily is important, but not the linchpin. And further to that, this treatment is broadly effective over many different viral subgroups. Dolutegravir and raltegravir are very similar in their adverse events: nausea, headaches, diarrhea, nasopharyngitis, with over 80% of participants in either arm reporting at least one of those minor events. Ultimately, dolutegravir is proven non-inferior to raltegravir in mutations and interactions as well. So the conclusion on the Spring 2 study then is that dolutegravir in combination with other NRTIs is still at least as good, if not better in some respects, than raltegravir. Again, Triumeq is a combo of dolutegravir plus the NRTIs, abacavir, and lamivudine. So this study is another proof of principle for Triumeq as a combination in that fashion. Next, we'll look at the Flamingo study. Flamingo featured 240 plus participants, open label featuring naive patients. This compared dolutegravir plus 2 NRTIs against darunavir boosted with ritonavir and 2 NRTIs. Again, some representation of participants were co-infected with hepatitis C, and a significant representation of people with both very high and very low viral loads. Less than 20% of the participants were women, and just under 25% were of African heritage. At 48 weeks, dolutegravir had a higher virologic response, approximately 7%, as well as fewer virologic non-responses, fewer discontinuations, and fewer adverse events. In summary, dolutegravir demonstrated overall superiority over darunavir with ritonavir. Specifically, dolutegravir showed superiority in high viral loads and was at least comparable to other treatments through all viral load strata. Flamingo, again, as part of their study, reminded that abacavir lamivudine exists as Kvexa, and that specifically abacavir sensitivity, again, must be considered before beginning any HIV therapy. And again, specifically Triumeq, which does include abacavir. Here's a short list of some of the known effects of dolutegravir alone when paired with other treatments. It is always advised that you discuss treatment options with your healthcare provider to make certain that you're using your treatments correctly. For example, the use of dolutegravir is not recommended for anyone using St. John's wort. Anyone using antacids or laxatives regularly may have to time their dosages differently. Again, just a short list of some of these known impacts with dolutegravir. Just a short summary here of the drug interactions that should be considered. And again, at the risk of being very redundant, we must insist anyone interested in this treatment be screened for abacavir sensitivity. The allergy is uncommon, but we must recommend it. Ultimately, we're prepared to suggest that Triumeq might be a valid treatment option for many people. It's a fixed-dose combination, and its development has closely monitored adverse effects and made tolerability a focus. It has minimal interactions relative to other HIV medications, accesses a broad spectrum of patients, and ultimately has a good safety profile. Specifically, fixed-dose combinations have simplified treatment for patients with HIV, increasing adherence. Dolutegravir is already approved for use in the U.S. in treatment of HIV infection in combination with other antiretrovirals. And in fact, abacavir and lamivudine are available as fixed-dose combinations themselves as Kvexa and Epsicom, respectively. So it is worth noting that all of Triumeq's components have been monitored by post-market surveillance or have undergone regulatory review previously. Again, that's the reason that we're looking at a pre-notice of compliance treatment that we're still reviewing under the common drug review. The benefit of this fixed-dose combination of dolutegravir, abacavir, and lamivudine specifically is that it offers fewer drug interactions. It can function as an alternative for women of childbearing potential and can offer an alternative to medications that may be associated with effects on the central nervous system or effects on bone and renal toxicity. However, again, due to the inclusion of abacavir, Triumeq is suitable only for patients who are negative for the genetic allele HLA-B5701. Again, that is a genetic allele that acts as a marker for abacavir sensitivity. So a patient can undergo a screening or a test to determine the presence of that marker and whether or not you specifically carry a sensitivity to abacavir. So now it's your turn, because as discussed, an important part of the Common Drug Review is soliciting the input of patients and stakeholders. The Common Drug Review's deliberative body will make a decision as to whether they recommend the provinces include this treatment on public drug plans. So your participation is important and impactful. We acknowledge that many people responding to this survey will have no experience with Triumeq. We understand that. The patient input questionnaire does not require input from treatment-experienced patients exclusively, and we want input from everyone, regardless of their treatment experience. We need to know the impact of HIV on you, the impact of your current HIV treatment. What adverse effects might you be experiencing, which are tolerable and which are not? What's the impact on caregivers, on service providers? For those of you who have experienced Triumeq, how did you find that treatment? For those of you who have taken Triumeq's components, what was your experience with those? Again, once you've completed the survey, CTAC will gather and collate the data. We will use that data to create a patient input submission to the Common Drug Review. Your responses will be anonymous, and even if portions of your responses are referenced, they will be cited in non-identifying ways. The survey will go live at the end of this presentation, and I will give you a link to complete it. The survey will stay live until the end of the day on Monday, August 25th. So again, I'll ask you to please complete the survey before next Monday, and preferably you'll complete the survey immediately following the presentation, just to keep it fresh in your mind. Moving forward, here are a couple of resources you might want to consider looking at in the coming days. There's the website for the manufacturer of Triumeq, which is ViiV Healthcare. The website for the Common Drug Review, which provides an overview of how the CDR works. Again, it can be a rather difficult procedure, but we are working on making it clear. And a valuable resource regarding HIV and HCV co-infection here, the HIVandhepatitis.com link, which is an area of research that CTAC looks at quite closely. At this point, I would love to welcome any questions you might have regarding Triumeq or the Common Drug Review. I'll launch the disclaimer that while I will do my best to answer all of your questions, if I do not have an answer readily available, I will have to get back to you. Also worth noting, some of the Health Canada regulations regarding clinical trials demand that the manufacturer cannot share all data with us, so I regret I may not have all the information you request. Furthermore, because of the unique nature of this submission in that many of its components are pre-approved, a lot of the data submitted to us by the manufacturer concerned itself specifically with dolutegravir, and not necessarily Triumeq exclusively. Now, some tests did, but some tests didn't. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome any questions anyone might have.
Hello, it's Walter.